When reading the Bible, there's two questions that can be extremely useful in helping us properly understand the text. And those questions are, who was the author and who were the original readers? From these two questions, we can begin to understand the purpose and context of the text so that we might accurately apply it to our lives today. In the case of 1 Corinthians, the answer to our first question is in the very first verse. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1 begins by saying, "This letter is from Paul." Now, the Apostle Paul lived most of his life as someone who persecuted Christians, and it wasn't until an intense encounter with Jesus that he decided to change his ways and join the people he had been persecuting as a new believer. Check out Acts chapter 9 if you want to read more about that encounter, but for now, you just need to know that this guy was a pretty big deal in the early days of the church. He's responsible for writing 13 books in the New Testament, most of which are letters of instruction and encouragement addressed to different faith communities in the early days of Christianity. Now, if it isn't obvious, 1 Corinthians is all one letter from Paul addressed to the church in Corinth. And this is made pretty clear in verse 2 of chapter 1, where Paul says, "I am writing to God's church in Corinth." To give you a brief history lesson, Corinth was a successful merchant city in ancient Greece. If there were two words to describe the culture of the city, they would probably be money and sex. Due to its strategic location, Corinth was a decently wealthy city and became a hub for consumerism. And as far as sexual morals go, they were loose at best. To give you an example, there was a case where a son and a stepmom were having an affair within the church. Alongside money and sex, other idols existed as well. Corinth was also a hub for many forms of paganism. Now you might be wondering, why would Paul be associating himself with a city like this? Well, because there were followers of Jesus in Corinth that were struggling to live a life that glorified God because they were surrounded by a culture that essentially did the opposite. Maybe the whole stepmom situation didn't make it clear, but these people needed guidance. So Paul starts the letter off with some quick words of encouragement and thanksgiving. He thanks God for the gifts he has given to the church in Corinth and says they have been enriched in every way. And then without skipping a beat, Paul proceeds to lecture the church on all of the things they've been doing wrong. Now, apparently, there was a lot the Corinthians had to learn because Paul covers a ton of topics. But if you read closely, you'll notice some overarching themes. Chapters 1 to 4 are all about division in the church. He calls people out for fighting over which spiritual leader to follow, saying that those arguments don't matter because all of our wisdom comes from God. And this is a pretty humble move on his part since one of the leaders being idolized was Paul himself. In chapters 5 to 8, he moves on to address some specific questions the church had and to condemn certain sins he had heard of them justifying. He condemns things like sexual immorality, pride, and in chapter 6, he even has to tell them to stop filing lawsuits against fellow believers. He also answers some questions regarding marriage, sex, and food that's been sacrificed to idols. Later, in chapters 9 to 14, Paul focuses in on what it means to live as a community devoted to Jesus. He provides instructions on specific things like public worship and spiritual gifts, but also gives the church a more simplified instruction by saying, "You should imitate me just as I imitate Christ." Paul finishes his thoughts in chapter 15 with a reminder of the importance and centrality of the gospel. He talks about how Christ has been raised from the dead, claiming victory over sin and death, and that as followers of Jesus, we claim that victory too and should live in a way that shows it. Overall, 1 Corinthians highlights that Christians are meant to live in ways different from the world. We serve a compassionate, holy God, and our actions should represent that. If we fall into the same sorts of things that the Corinthians did, it will affect our relationship with God and can distort how others see Jesus through us. Our words and actions should point towards Christ, not away from him.